Um, Welcome everyone to the Healthcare Project and Change Association Storytelling Community. This is our I forget how manyth workshop, probably about the fifth speaker we have now on. And the topic for today is how to use stories to catalyze change. If you didn't expect to be, if that's not what you expected, I urge you to stay on anyway. This is going to be more interesting than most of your other meetings today, probably all of them. So please do stay on, because today we have as our guest speaker David Lee. He's got a master's in education, and for over 30 years, David has been using and teaching storytelling to therapists, coaches, educators, and leaders. Um, David was first introduced to the power of storytelling as a change catalyzing tool in his first career as a hypnotherapist working with trauma survivors. He has presented at conferences throughout North America and Australia, and is the author of Powerful Storytelling Techniques. So without further ado, David, the floor is yours, and really looking forward to hearing you speak.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to sharing this with you all because storytelling is such a fun topic and skill. And what I found over the years is not only does it make you a more interesting communicator, whether it's one to many or one on one, but it also just makes your work way more fun. I just want to give you a quick sort of like backstory or origin story of what got me so fascinated with storytelling and convinced of the usefulness of it. So, as Bryn mentioned, my first career was as a trauma therapist and hypnotherapist. And through that, I was introduced to the work of Dr. Milton Erickson. And Erickson was known as like an absolute magician in his ability to work with people that other people just threw up their hands and said, there's no way to reach that person, and able to work with them and catalyze change. And a couple of the reasons why he was so good at that was instead of trying to get the person to see his point of view as the initial point of entry. So let me stop for a second. Think of your own experience, whether it's with your teenage kids or with coworkers who see a situation so differently. If you're like most of us, your initial thought is like, I got to get them to see my point of view. And therapists are the same way. So let me share a quick story that gives you an example of the genius of Erickson and how he would meet people where they were at versus trying to convince them to see the world that he was. So one of the like archetypal Milton Erickson stories was how one of the patients at a psychiatric hospital that he worked at had a the delusion that he was Jesus Christ. Not an uncommon delusion that somebody has. Nobody ever picks like minor league, kind of humans. And so all the attempts by psychiatrists and other clinicians to convince this person and give proof that he's not Jesus Christ fell on deaf ears. And think about, again, your own experience with this when you're trying to convince people directly that, like, no, you can do that, or it really is a good thing, or that limiting belief you have about yourself is not true, and how people are, we have defenses against worldviews that are different than our own. So back to the story. And so because Erickson was so good at connecting with people where they were, what he does is he goes up to this patient and he says, I hear you're a carpenter. And we've got, I don't remember the specifics, what they needed to build. Let's say bookshelves. We've got bookshelves that need to be built in the new, library for patients. Can you help us out? And the guy has to agree to help out because he's a carpenter. Like, don't be a slacker, like, get to work. And so he starts helping out. And now he's starting to interact with a bunch of new people. And now he's interacting in a new and different way. And that was the entree to him coming out of his delusion. And so he wasn't just famous for that. He was also famous for using stories as a way to create an experience where the person can either see the world differently or see themselves differently, or one of the ways that I like to describe it is create like a virtual reality training video where they can try on new behaviors. So I'm going to give you an example of that. But before I do, I just want to share with you my one and only slide. Okay. Um, I put this together to yesterday because I thought it would be a good um, visual for what we're trying to do here in helping people respond productively to change and how stories can help them do that. So if we first we start off on this left side of the slide, the how beliefs affect our emotional and mental state, and then how our state affects our beliefs. Okay, so like what does that mean? What does that look and sound like? So if let's say if there's some big change happening in the organization I work at, and my belief is I don't have the wherewithal to deal with this change. This change is going to negatively impact me. So let's say those are my beliefs. If those are my beliefs as I think about this change, that's going to create a physiological emotional state of fear, overwhelm, fight or flight, feeling beleaguered, etc. Okay, what oftentimes people don't realize though, and this is where the work that I did in my first career in the mind body medicine field really helped me appreciate, is our state affects our beliefs, and then very much our state affects how we see the world and how we act in the world. So think about if you, okay, actually, that rather than me speak abstractly, let me use a story to illustrate my point. So one of the reasons why you want to collect stories from your everyday life is you can use them to illustrate your point, to make your point more understandable and or more memorable. So quick story related to how our state affects our beliefs and our perceptions and performance. So this happened when I first noticed this, it was like, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago, but it's happened many times since. And any of you that do business travel can relate to this, the non-glamorous world of business travel. So I was at the end of a multi-day business trip and I'm slogging through the airport and I'm just feeling worn out from not sleeping well, breathing, hotel, airport, airplane air, etc. So I'm trudging down the concourse, wheeling my wheeler carry-on bag. And so my physiology, my state was one of the biochemistry, the breathing, the energy level was all of worn out. And so my emotions, that's why I sometimes say emotional physiological state, because you can't have an emotion without an accompanying physiology because we're biological creatures. So my emotional state is beleaguered, um, uh, no energy. Oh, woe is me. And so my perception of all the things I had to do when I got home, I'm thinking like, oh, I've got this, I've got that, and oh, that project, and I still haven't come up with ideas on how to deal with it. And so I saw my workload as being really overwhelming. So that was my perception of what I had to do. So it was being shaped by my state. And then as I'm trudging along, what to my wondering eyes did appear but a Starbucks. And cue up angelic choir, like, oh, and I'm like, I see my salvation. So I haul my sorry self over there. And this is back in the day when I would drink their venti iced espresso drinks that have 4 shots of espresso. And I'll talk about jet fuel, down those, and within a matter of like minutes, my state, goes from what I said before to like totally jacked up on caffeine. And now my beliefs are like, hey, I can handle anything, no problem. My perception of all the things I had to do, it was sort of like, oh, that project I have to do, like, I'll figure it out. My to-do list, man, I'll just crush it. When you're jacked up on caffeine and that hyper mode. And later I thought, notice what happened. And so this is why I'm sharing with this specific story with you. All I So what didn't happen was the external world didn't change, obviously. All that stuff I had to do still was there. That part's obvious. The part that was interesting to me, though, was I didn't have to change my beliefs. I didn't have to change my self talk to more empowering self talk. Like, you could do this, or it's not the end of the world, or whatever. All I did was change my state, i.e., I changed my biochemistry. And that shift in biochemistry changed how I saw my world. And so that's changing how I saw the world through ingesting caffeine. You can use stories to shift how whether again it's one-on-one or in a group, to shift the state of your group or your individual person. So now they can see this change in a very different way. And what we know from the world of elite performance, and then we know from the world of our own worlds, is emotional state affects performance. So if a person or a group, again, is in fight or flight, their behaviors, their reactions aren't nearly as productive as if they are in a cool, calm, collected state. So how do you use stories to shift state, which shifts perception, and shifts state to shift beliefs? And I'm going to give you an example of that in a moment. And then I'll also link it to the same story, shifting beliefs that therefore shifts state and how that shifts perception. Okay, so I'm going to stop the sharing the slides here. Okay. Okay, so here's an example. And actually, I'm just going to put this in the chat for a second. Iced palpitations. That's great. Um, one of the things that I say if I'm teaching storytelling is two of your best friends are for instance or for example. So if you're giving a presentation and you want people to understand what you're talking about, is try to come up with examples or little mini stories to illustrate your point, whatever your point is. So for instance, for example, okay, so here's an example of using a story to help shift somebody's state and their beliefs and therefore their perception of the problem they're facing. Okay, so here's what happened. So I did a program for a college several years ago, and at the end of the program, this young woman comes up to me, and she's a new supervisor, and she says, like, could I get your advice on something? Like, okay, sure. And her presentation was the body language and demeanor of somebody who was feeling like beaten down and fearful. Like, ooh, what's going on here? And so she said, I'm a new supervisor for this team, and one of the team members is an older woman. She's been there like 30 years and has a reputation of being really mean and verbally abusive, like the classic toxic, coworker. Should have been fired years ago. Previous supervisors never addressed it, and now I have to deal with it. And I tried once to have a conversation with her about her behavior, and it didn't go well. What am I supposed to do next? And in the old days, I would have launched into like, oh, she asked me for my advice, I'll give her advice. But having the background of how the mind affects the mind affects the body, and the body affects the mind, I'm like, she's not in a state to take in information and take in a new perspective. She's in a state of like collapse, and beliefs of like, there's really nothing I can do. If I have a conversation, it's not going to go well. Um, and so even if I said like, here's some ways of handling it, probably with her beliefs, it's like, oh, that won't work with her, that won't work with me, I don't have those skills, etc. So I know, or I believe, that job number one is to shift her state. If I can shift her state to get out of that collapsed, there's really nothing you can do, uh, um, then maybe she can hear a different point of view than what she believes, and then she can perceive her situation through the eyes of possibility versus through the eyes of nothing I do will matter. Okay, I'm going to stop for a second. Before I shared with you all what I did, if you want to type in the chat, if you have any questions, or you can unmute yourself. And actually, Bryn, to get us started, do you have any questions about any of that? Um, while I'm waiting for any chat questions, anything that you want to, or any things you want to add to the mix?
Well, I mean, what I found particularly fascinating was how you made those links between how the story can shift the emotional state, which can then shift perception. And I really liked that. I've been furiously scribbling notes. Um, I mean, for you, do you find, do you need to find those stories that have an emotional content in? Like, should the story always mention emotion in order to get that shift in the listener?
Man, great questions. So, um, one of the things that I think about related to the second question about look for stories that include emotion is any story that has an emotional, that tends to elicit emotions, is great because it tends to be more memorable. Um, so number one. Number two is also part of what your question's getting at, which is so important, is learning to be intentional with your storytelling, to ask, like, what's the purpose of telling the story? So what's the change I'm hoping to catalyze in the individual or the audience? And so maybe, so in this case with this young woman, I want to catalyze, I want to shift her state, and I want to stimulate hope, optimism, and also, and you'll find out in the story, I want to use surprise and humor to break her out of that grip of fear. And Bryn, this is where your sense of humor like makes you like totally. That's one of your superpowers in being a storyteller. And great, thank you, Gareth. I'm gonna get to your question in just a second. So thanks for asking the question. I'm a huge believer in the power of humor to help break somebody out of their hyper intense, like, oh my God, this is the end of the world, or their embarrassment or shame, or this is like a real, like, career ending faux pas I made. And that's where I love self deprecating humor. And if this was a longer I've got so many examples of boneheaded things I've done that I could use, but I will put together a document with links of videos, um, of stories that illustrate uses of stories. And one is my favorite, um, one of my two favorite self-deprecating stories that I use to help a person um, put something they did in the moment that they're obsessing about into perspective. So I'll do that with a follow-up doc. Also, one other quick thing related to Bryn, your question, and then Gareth, that and I'll send you a document on this. The biggest question I get when I'm teaching storytelling is like, well, where do you find stories? And I'll put some examples again in this document. So in everyday life, what I do, because I've been doing this for so long, it's really natural. And so anytime something happens that I think like, wow, that was weird, or that was funny, or I didn't expect that, or like, whoa, anytime I have any sort of, oh, or that was really cool, I note that. And I might not know at the moment how I'm going to use it. And oftentimes I do, but other times I don't know. I just know I had a reaction to it. And I will record it. My like secret weapon, and this is so silly, but of all the stuff I've taught about storytelling, this is the number one thing that people like, this was so helpful. My secret weapon is to curate these little moments using a 2-column story table. And I just use a Word doc with, a table with 2 columns and one. So each row is a story. One cell is I write enough narrative that I can remember by reading what I wrote like years later and tell the story. And on the left cell, so the left column, are key words that I can later search. Like, I want to use a story. Like, what are some stories about dealing with change? What are stories about limiting beliefs? What are stories about courageous conversations? And so if I'm giving a presentation at a conference or I'm doing a workshop that I haven't done for a while, like, what are those stories I tell? I've got that. So it's things from everyday life. Also, those of you who like podcasts, notice podcast stories that you're like, whoa, that's cool. And then you can use those stories. Okay, so I'm interested in your views on the impact of including numbers in a story and shifting state. Oh, great. Um, Anything that you can use to make your story have a greater impact, bring it on. In fact, I don't know if I'll have time for this. I might end up, if I don't, I might just record it. Um, one of the things I was thinking in preparing for this is to share with you a story that is one of my favorite stories to share when I do resilience or managing change presentations, that came from doing a power walk on a hot September day and coming across caterpillars that at least in New England, we call woolly bears, and how I've layered on. I I first told the story with in a particular way, and then years later I layered on another story on top of the story, which adds more power. And specifically to your part, Gareth, one of my favorite genres of stories is what I just call cool science stories or cool research stories. So for instance, if I'm doing training on leadership or on psychological safety and the importance of being skilled at making it as comfortable as possible for people with less power than you to speak up, check this out. Um, One of my favorite stories comes from the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, when he talks about research about surgeons who got sued and those who didn't. And check this out. It wasn't the skill level. So scientists, researchers studied who got sued and who didn't. It had nothing to do with their skill level. It had all to do with how they related to patients. The ones who related to patients in a domineering and indifferent way, they're the ones who got sued. Now, I'm just going to give you a quick snippet of the research to show you how sharing the research and not the takeaway makes it more interesting. How they discovered this is the scientists recorded, I think it was 3 20-second snippets in conversations between surgeons and their patients in the beginning, in the middle, and then the end. And then they used this audio filtering piece of equipment that could filter out the wavelength that the words get, transported through, and only allowed voice tone. So the researchers could only hear voice tone. They couldn't actually hear what the words the physicians were using, and they could predict with something like 95% accuracy just by voice tone who got sued and who didn't. Isn't that wild? And so I love using that like really fascinating piece of research to illustrate the importance of communicating concern and not like, hey, we're doing the change is what it is. Deal with it, guys. Which sometimes is the attitude. When you have power, you think like, hey, the peasants just got to deal with it. And so I tell that story as a way to communicate the desire, the human desire. This this is a strong way of saying it, but the research backs it up, of retribution when you feel injustice. And actually, I'll do one other bit. I'm going off. Hopefully, this is okay, guys. But I loved your question, Gareth. Um, I, I'm just going to give you one other bit of example. Let me of using it's a scientific research to strengthen your story and your message, especially for those who are very data driven. And another bit of science that I connected with the malpractice story, and again, that's in the book Blink, which is actually a great, both did I type? Oh, I did. Okay. Um, and Adam Grant are great examples of authors who use really fascinating research. And I don't remember where I came across this, but there's a famous anthropologist who wrote a book called um, Human Universals, I think is the title. And he wanted to see if there were universal values across cultures throughout the world. And he identified several hundred that he could not find a culture that did not value these values. And two of them were justice and retribution. And so I oftentimes I'll combine that with the malpractice research to really try to get the point across that you don't want to go against human nature. It's embedded in human nature. So if you want people, so let me stick to change here, for people to be willing to hear why you're doing the change. And even though there's some negative sides to it, that we really need to do this, you want to make sure they feel heard and cared about because, and think of your own experience, we as humans inherently want to be respected and cared about and inherently despise injustice and look for ways of payback if we feel unfairly treated. So let me stop for a second. Anything you want to say on that before we get to what I did? What I shared. Oh my God, what I shared with that young supervisor. I haven't even told that story. Any Bryn, do you want to say anything? Or anybody else have any questions or anything?
I've just been finding it fascinating and furiously scribbling notes. So,
Cool.
does anyone else have a question for David quickly?
We're good. Okay, and
We're
I could
good.
see if something comes up. So we great. So great question, Gareth. So you got a bonus. Hopefully that was helpful for everybody in terms of a whole other genre. And it's actually because I geek out on research and I love that stuff. I find it especially fun to use. And I'll tell you, in um, when people say nice things to me about like they love my presentation or they've been to a bunch of talks I've done over the years, the two things that they say are love your stories and love the scientific research. So um, using telling the story of the research, not just the takeaway. Okay. And again, uh, Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant are two great writers, and Adam's a social psychologist. So to give both examples of how to do it and also great research you can use to bolster your point. Okay, so back to my overwhelmed, scared supervisor. And so again, to bring us back into what was happening, she was asking for advice. She was clearly scared, shut down, and probably not in a state where she could entertain any suggestions I gave. So I'm thinking job number one, remember that slide, is to shift her state so she can have a belief I can do this and she can and there's a way to approach this that can work and she can see this challenge of this toxic coworker as something that she can handle. Okay. So here's the story I shared with her. And I said, it reminds me, your situation reminds me of a situation a friend of mine, Fran, had years ago. And uh, she got hired for a major advertising firm and as to manage the employees. And the partners told her, one of the things that we want you to do as part of your job is to fire Mary. And my friend Fran's like, can you give me a little more details about why? And so they said, Mary's, super toxic. Everybody hates her. She's really mean, blah, blah, blah. And Fran's like, well, how come, nobody ever has dealt with it before? Well, and whatever excuse they made the excuse. So my friend Fran said, well, I'm not going to just fire her. I want to give her a chance to see if she can come around. So Fran did a bunch of Fran's like super skilled with people, did a bunch of things, nothing worked. So she's like, okay, then we've got to have the conversation. And I love it. A consultant friend of mine, I first heard this term from her. So it's a conversation to free up her future, for future opportunities. And so Fran brings Mary into like a conference room, and she asks like, "Hey, Mary, how you doing?" Mary's like, "Hey, fine." Like, why? So Mary's a really, crusty old bird. And so Fran goes, "Well, you just don't seem happy here. You seem really angry all the time, and you take it out on people. For instance, like this morning, like Mary had just done something this morning, and she said a few other things, and Mary says whatever Mary says in response, and then suddenly Mary goes, 'Are you firing me?' And Fran's like, 'Yeah.' And Mary bursts out laughing. She goes, 'I can't believe it. I never thought getting fired, having that conversation would be fun.' And and Fran goes, 'Yeah.' And she goes, 'You know what, Mary? I bet, 6 months from now, I'm going to get a call from you, and you're going to be in a job that was made for you, not like this job. And you're going to be so much happier.' And Mary's like, 'Man, I'd certainly like that.' And sure enough, somewhere about 6 months later or so, Fran gets a call from Mary. And Mary says, 'I just want to thank you for firing me. And what I've ended up doing is going back to school to study what I always really wanted to study. And I'm happier than I've ever been, than I've ever been before.' And as I'm telling, as I'm telling that story to this young supervisor, I can like she's surprised, like she gets a big smile because like Mary laughing about getting fired being fun, like who saw that coming? So there's a plot twist that like you don't see coming, and then the humor in it, and then the positive outcome. So now her state is shifted because of the humor in it, and also the positive outcome, like, oh, it can be a good thing. And now her state is shifted. So now she's in a place where she can hear whatever I'm having to say about how she might deal with it. So that's an example of using a story to shift somebody's state so now they can hear what you have to say. And also, it's all happening at the same time. Use a story because you're shifting their state. You're also instantly shifting their perspective and their beliefs. Let me stop. Any comments or questions about either the mechanics, the usefulness, or okay, Bryn. Um, oh, okay. So, Bryn,
Mm.
great. About the
I
numbers
was just
effect.
adding to
Yeah.
Garrett's, but I do love that story, and it immediately made me think of a manager of mine who used to do something very, very similar in managing very awkward members of staff. Is just opening it up with, instead of a conversation about how you're not performing in this job, say, where do you want to be? Where's your future? And very often he found people would quite quickly come to the conclusion that they didn't want to stay there. They wanted to go back and study or others. So very powerful.
And so that's a great example of so remember I said for instance or for example, are two of your friends. Let's say you're trying to coach um, new supervisors about helping people who maybe aren't a good fit to self-select out. You can share that so you could say, so for instance, I work for somebody who would do, and then say that. and you can dial it up. So that's great in and of itself. So that's using a concrete example to make that point more understandable to your
Mm,
listeners. You can also, and this is where the two-column story table comes in, you can spend some time thinking about what's a particular time that happened with somebody. Like either the supervisor told me about it, or I was in the room and the person came to that conclusion, whatever. And then jot that down in your two-column story table so you can actually literally tell a story when that happened. And that makes it even more come alive to the
mm,
listener. Cool, thank you. Okay, so no questions. So I do want to give people a chance to tell a story. This was, by the way, my plan was 15 minutes in to do this exercise. Oops. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to break up into approximately three per group. There might be one group that's four, whatever. And we're going to break out for, oh, cool. Awesome, Allison. So that is a powerful story that you can tell. And also, um, for those of you who didn't see the chat, dreading the redundancy conversation. Now, one of the things also with stories, you don't have to use the story only for that specific scenario. You could use that same, like, I'm dreading the redundancy conversation for somebody who's dreading have a conversation with their spouse or with their boss, their supervisor. Let's say their supervisor is a micromanager and they're like, I really need them to back off, but I'm afraid that's going to, have repercussions. You can use that story from another context to
mm.
illustrate that thing you fear is going to be a bad thing ends up being a good thing. Okay, so awesome, Ellison. Thank you. So here's what I want to do. And actually, who's ever doing the time for the groups, if you can back it down to 6 minutes, okay? For at least one person in your group to share a short story. So again, it's 6 minutes, a short story of either something that at the time you thought was a disaster, and now looking back, you realize that it opened the door to something wonderful, or it had a hidden gift in some other way, or a situation where you didn't think you could do something like, that's too intense for me, or I don't have the ability, and you were able to. Okay. So I want to just, and maybe you can get like all three of you in if you're like super fast storytellers, whatever. But I just want to give you a chance to at least try your hat at one. So go ahead, please. And thanks, Shannon. Break into the groups, and then we'll come back and I'll end off with a story. I'm aware of the time. And so um, I want to end off. If there's any quick questions, go ahead and put them in the. Okay, Kate's typing. Great. And so here's the deal. I want to end off with one final story. You like to teleport. Um, um, to give you an example of using an common everyday experience and how you can use it, and it also directly relates to the topic of um, helping people respond resourcefully to change. Okay, so here's the story. Um, and actually, you know what I'm doing? I'm gonna play the video. Just give you a change of pace here. Um, I'll show you the video of this. So, okay, going back to Teams. Okay. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Okay. Whoops. Get fired. We lose a job. We have a life-threatening illness. Okay, so this is a clip from a program that I did on resilience. And so the concept I want them to understand, or the concept I'm trying to teach here, is you can literally tune your brain, more specifically, the part of the brain called the reticular activating system, that we can tune our brain to notice opportunities and gifts in the midst of crisis, whereas we typically just notice the bad part. So here we go. So I can just say this, or I could use a story to hopefully make the idea sticky. And sticky. The reason why I'm using that term is there's a wonderful book called Made to Stick, which I highly recommend. At the very least, watch a video that's a synopsis of it. And they talk about the difference between messages that stick and those that go in one ear and out the other. And one of the 6 characteristics of sticky messages that live on forever are they're told through stories. And also, back to Bryn, your analogy, the teleport, one of the 6 is the message is made concrete through analogy. Yeah. Okay, so here we go. Okay. I have found personally to be so powerful. Several years back, it was a hot September day, and I was doing some power walking. And because of a knee injury, I can't run, so I try to walk as fast as I can to get some cardio going. And so I'm walking as fast as I can, but the problem was there were all these little caterpillars that growing up we called them woolly bears, the little brown ones with a little black stripe. They were all catching rays on the road. And and I was feeling bad for them because, they were not long for the world. But I wanted to get the cardio thing happening, so I wasn't going to like, here, little woolly bear, like that. So what I decided to do is I took my shirt off and I was just like, whoosh, 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 as I'm walking down the road. It just dawned on me, like, I wonder what people thought as they're driving by. I never really thought about that part. But the part that I was focusing on was the woolly bear's perspective, if they indeed have one. But you think about it, one moment you're hanging loose, enjoying the sun, the next moment you're like flying into the bushes. And I was thinking, isn't this just like a perfect metaphor for life when we go through change, challenge, and uncertainty? That from our ground level perspective, we get fired, we lose a job, we have a life-threatening illness. It's horrible, it's frightening, it's traumatic. But from a higher perspective, in this case, I could see what they could not, it was really a gift. And it's so hard to have that perspective when you're the one getting punted off the road into the bushes. And so one of the practices that I have found incredibly useful is learning to tune your brain when you're facing difficulties, because it's natural when we're facing a difficult situation. I don't know if you know this, but the Chinese character for crisis is a combination of 2 characters. It's so easy for us to focus on the danger, the fear, the stress part of it. We don't tune into, unless we discipline ourselves, that other Chinese character, opportunity. I remember years ago, Dennis Waitley saying it so beautifully, that crisis is opportunity riding a dangerous wind. And so here's something I'd like to ask you to do. To just take a moment on your own and reflect on a crisis in your life that happened years ago, that at the time you felt like the woolly bear. You were focused, understandably so, on the trauma, the fear. Okay. So, then and then years later. So a couple of things, I'm going to stop the share and then I'm going to just briefly show you how I added to it years later. So that's an example of using a common everyday experience. So back to Bryn, one of your first question, I found myself thinking like, oh, this is interesting. When it happened, like the woolly bear, my experience. And one of the ways of thinking in analogies, of using everyday experiences that you can then turn into stories and analogies, is to say, like, what's the lesson here? Or what's this a potential metaphor for? And so in this case, like, oh yeah, it's like from their world, it's the end of the world, their perspective, but from mine, I'm saving their life. What's that like? So that's the thought process. Now, I'm going to quickly show you how I added to it later. Um, okay. So let's see. So let's see. So Bryn, I can see you see the full slide of the tuner. Okay, cool. So, I showed the tuner. So using a visual image to capture the tuning in. And then what I did was in longer versions of the story, more recently, I talk about Napoleon Hill, who maybe some of you are aware of. He was in the early 20th century in the US, where he interviewed titans of industry and famous scientists like Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, Henry Ford. Is very US centric. And to find out what how they saw the world and how they became so successful. And he said one of the things that really stood out to him, what made them so different from other people, is they said without exception, their greatest breakthroughs and opportunities always came cloaked as problems. And so when they faced, like Thomas Edison's lab got burned down, like that's a crisis. That's not a good thing, you know. When they had some major catastrophe, they were like, something good. This is opening up possibilities. It's like the ecosystem the system got shaken up, and now it's not so rigidly in place. And so whereas the, average person would be like, it's the end of the world and hyper focus on the woolly bear side of it. They knew, okay, now's the time. Start looking at what are the opportunities here. Don't miss out. And so because their brain was tuned that way, they could see those possibilities. And so what I started to add on to, instead of just doing the this tune, from back in the day, retro tuner, I would talk about wherever you are right now, think about it. There are many types of music playing in your room that you can't hear. There's hip hop, there's classical, there's easy listening, there's jazz. And if you had a tuner, you could tune into those different stations, and they're all there. It just depends on where you tune into. And so typically when there's some big change, especially if it has negative impact, our brain naturally, with a negativity bias, tunes into the crisis station. We have to teach it to tune into that station. And so that's the added piece that I add, especially for those who maybe who are like, okay, that's a cute little story about the caterpillars, but like, how's that in real life? So that's where I add the Napoleon Hill story to it. And then um, what I try to remember to say when I'm doing the full teaching of this is the reason for then having people do their own experience of that is I don't want them to have the takeaway like, oh, that was a cute story, and okay, Napoleon Hill and the famous people. Experience is the best teacher. And if you can use a story like that to cue people up to then think of their own experience. Now they're drawing from the inarguable experiences that they've had and helping them curate their experiences of when they've had that happen, when there's actually a gift, an opportunity, open a door. So maybe somebody dumped them in a relationship and they thought it was the end of the world, but it because they got dumped, they got to meet the love of their life, or they get fired,
Mm.
etc. And so the story cues up the person to think of their own examples, and then the real power comes from their examples. And if they do that enough, it cues the reticular activating system to be able to, even in the midst of crisis, see opportunity. And I say that from personal experience. I still, when like sucky things happen to me, I still like get my woolly bear on and I'm like, oh, what a drag. I hate this. This is a disaster. And then the other part of me is like, okay, what's the gift here? What's the opportunity? Um, and because I've done this long enough, it's easy, it's fairly easy for me to do that. And even as I'm still being upset, I'm also like, okay, like I know it's there. So, yes, I love
Wonderful.
that, Melanie. Absolutely. 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 That, so about timing is crucial. Um, so storytelling is a tool. And remember, I talked about like, what is you want to think about? Why am I telling this story? You want to be thinking about um, reverse engineering your goal of the conversation or the presentation. And so maybe you're like recognizing this person right now only wants to be heard. They don't need any, there's a silver lining perspective shift right now. So absolutely, Melanie. And then Zoe, um, uh, important to acknowledge the part between something negative happening to seeing the positive, missing the middle part. Yes, 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 yes. I love it. Absolutely. And man, I just was listening to an amazing podcast yesterday about um, acceptance versus surrender, and then going through the grieving process. And I'll make a note, um, and I'll put that in my list
Yeah.
of resources.
That
So
that would be one. Oh,
I'm sorry.
sorry.
No,
Carry on.
that would be one thing. Yeah, okay. And also, just to answer your or not answer, but to speak to the storytelling part of what you're saying, Zoe, is this might be what I might do in that situation is just be a good listening ear, and that's all I do. And that's probably all I would do. What I might do in another kind of situation in reading where the person is at, um, or let's say let's say the person is stuck and I don't know, like, I can't handle this. Um, I hate this change, whatever. And let's say they're not really, quote, in touch with their feelings kind of person, former therapist in me. Okay. And so what I might do is share a story, maybe of that I've gone through or somebody else, and how they went through, like, fixated on this isn't fair, I want the old days, and then shared, I'll do it for me, talked about my inner world of dealing with the grief and the fear, whatever my process was. Because I believe one of the gifts um, of sharing your personal stories, obviously always using discernment. One of the gifts of sharing your personal stories, including your inner world, what you are thinking, what you were feeling, the conflicts that were going on, it helps the listener connect with their interior world. And it helps them start to, like, oh yeah, I feel that way. And it helps them work through whatever they need to work through. That's one of the reasons why 12-step programs like Alcoholics Anonymous, etc., are so powerful, is people telling their stories.
Yeah.
So
Wonderful. David, I'm going to have to stop us there,
yes, yeah, please, sorry, yes.
but it has been an incredibly interesting and thought-provoking session. I've never seen the chat so lively. And also, I've loved how you've taken us on a journey using your stories through how you use these stories in your educational and therapeutic practice. I mean, I've made a page full of notes. I've had half a dozen ideas for follow-up sessions, and we will definitely share all the links. And hopefully, we might, invite you back again. Um, Before I leave, I do need to just give a bit of a trailer for upcoming HPCA meetings. We've got some regional network meetings in London, Midlands, the Southwest, and the Southeast. You can join up regardless of the region you're in. We've got community webinars coming up. They are available on the community. I won't recite them now, but our next storytelling session is due to be on the 7th of November with Professor Antonio Longiori, where it's about the benefits of storytelling and story listening loops within participatory research. But most importantly, thank you so much again, David, for coming. It's been wonderful chatting, and I'm sure we're going to talk again in the future. Thank you,
I would
and
love
please,
that. Thank you.
everyone, give a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Take it to all in New England from us in Old England. Thanks, David.
Thank you.